Picture this. A convoy of trucks rolls across a landscape so empty, so lifeless, that it looks like the surface of another planet. No grass, no trees, no shade, just cracked earth stretching in every direction until it dissolves into a shimmering haze on the horizon. And then the trucks stop. The back doors swing open. And out step dozens of wild horses, blinking into the blinding sun, standing on a plain of sand and stone where nothing has grown for as long as anyone can remember. To almost everyone watching, this looked like a death sentence. Releasing living animals into a barren desert with no food and no water seemed less like conservation and more like abandonment. Critics called it reckless. Some called it cruel. How could any creature survive in a place that offered nothing? And yet, the scientists behind this experiment weren't guessing. They were testing an idea so strange, so counterintuitive, that when the results finally came in, even they could barely believe what they were seeing. Because what those horses did to that dead desert over the following months and years didn't just help them survive. It began to transform the land itself. And by the time researchers pieced together exactly how it happened, they realized they had stumbled onto something that could change the way we fight one of the most dangerous crises on the planet. So what really happened when China released wild horses into a desert with no grass? Stay with me, because the answer is far stranger and far more hopeful than anyone expected. First, you have to understand what kind of horses these were. These weren't ordinary farm horses or the kind you might ride on a weekend trail. These were Przewalski's horses, and they are unlike any other horse alive today. They are stocky and muscular, with thick necks, upright manes like a mohawk, and a dusty golden-brown coat that blends perfectly into dry, open country. But the truly remarkable thing about them is this: they are the only truly wild horses left on Earth. Every other horse you have ever seen, from racehorses to wild mustangs, descends from animals that were once tamed by humans. Przewalski's horses were never fully domesticated. They carry a wildness in their blood that goes back tens of thousands of years. And that wildness almost disappeared forever. By the middle of the 20th century, these horses had been hunted, pushed off their land, and starved during brutal winters until they vanished completely from the wild. The last confirmed sighting in nature came in the 1960s. After that, they existed only in zoos and reserves, a scattered handful of survivors carrying the last of their kind. The species had effectively gone extinct in the wild, and for a while it seemed like these ancient horses would only ever exist behind fences. But conservationists refused to let them fade away. Slowly, carefully, they began breeding the survivors, building up the numbers, and dreaming of an almost impossible goal: to take these horses, born and raised in captivity, and return them to the wild lands their ancestors once roamed. And some of those lands were in the harsh, arid regions of northern China and Mongolia, where the horses had lived for thousands of years before they were driven out. That brings us back to the desert. The region chosen for this reintroduction wasn't a lush, welcoming environment. It was part of a vast belt of dry, degraded land, the kind of terrain that has been spreading across China for decades. And this is where the story connects to something much bigger than a few horses. Because China has been fighting a slow-moving disaster that most people outside the country have never heard of. It is called desertification, and it is the process by which once living land turns to lifeless sand. Across northern China, overgrazing, drought, deforestation, and shifting climate patterns have combined to turn enormous stretches of grassland into desert. Fertile plains that once fed herds and farms have hardened into barren ground. Sandstorms born in these deserts sweep across the country, sometimes reaching all the way to major cities, choking the air and burying roads. For generations, this creeping desert has swallowed villages, destroyed farmland, and forced families to abandon land their ancestors had worked for centuries. It is one of the largest environmental battles on the planet, and China has poured enormous resources into stopping it, planting billions of trees and building what some call a Great Green Wall to hold the sand back. But planting trees is slow, expensive, and doesn't always work in the harshest zones. Scientists were searching for other tools, other ideas, anything that might help bring dead land back to life. And that search led some of them to a radical question. What if the answer wasn't to plant something into the land, but to release something onto it? What if living animals, the very creatures that had vanished from these regions, could do something that no human effort could easily replicate? It sounds backwards. For decades, grazing animals were blamed for creating deserts in the first place. Too many sheep and goats stripping the grass down to the roots is exactly how healthy grassland collapses into sand. So how could adding more grazing animals possibly help? This is the paradox at the heart of the entire experiment, and it is the reason so many people expected it to fail. The scientists had a theory, though, and it came from studying how nature worked before humans disrupted it. In a healthy wild ecosystem, large grazing animals don't destroy the land. They move across it. They graze in one area, then wander to another, giving the first patch time to recover. They aren't packed into a single field by fences. They roam freely, following ancient instincts, and in doing so, they become part of a cycle that actually keeps the land alive. The problem was never grazing itself. The problem was grazing in the wrong way, in the wrong numbers, without the natural balance that wild animals bring. So the plan was to release these wild horses and let them behave the way their ancestors did. No fences boxing them into one patch of dirt, no herders driving them in circles, just wild horses free to roam across the open land, doing what wild horses have done for tens of thousands of years. And then the scientists would watch and wait and see what happened. At first, honestly, it was tense. The horses had to find scattered water sources on their own. They had to learn to survive brutal temperature swings, freezing nights and scorching days. They had to search out whatever sparse vegetation clung to life in the hardier corners of the region. Some people were certain the animals would waste away, but Przewalski's horses are tougher than almost any horse on earth. Their bodies are built for exactly this kind of punishment, able to survive on poor food and little water, able to endure conditions that would kill softer, domesticated breeds. They didn't just cling to life. They adapted, and slowly, the land around them began to change. Now, before we get to exactly what changed and why it stunned the researchers, I want to ask you something. If you're finding this story as fascinating as I do, take 1 second right now to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps more than you know, and it means the next time we uncover a story like this, it lands right in your feed. Drop a comment too and tell me, did you think these horses would survive, or did you expect this experiment to fail? I read every single one. All right, now let's get to the part that shocked the scientists. Here's what started to happen. As the horses roamed and grazed, they did something that seems almost too simple to matter. They ate, they walked, and they left dung behind them across the landscape. And that dung turned out to be one of the most powerful ingredients for bringing dead land back to life. Think about what animal dung actually is. It is packed with nutrients, with organic matter, with the raw material that soil needs to become fertile. In a barren desert, the ground is often lifeless, not just because it lacks water, but because it lacks nutrients and living microorganisms. There is nothing to feed new plant growth. But when hundreds of horses spread their droppings across a wide area, they begin fertilizing the soil naturally, seeding it with the exact ingredients that turn dead dirt into living earth. Each pile of dung becomes a tiny pocket of fertility, a starting point where microbes wake up, where insects arrive, where the machinery of a living ecosystem slowly switches back on. But it gets better, and this is the part that truly amazed the researchers. That dung wasn't just fertilizer. It was also full of seeds. As the horses grazed on whatever tough plants they could find, they swallowed seeds along with the vegetation. Those seeds passed through their digestive systems and came out the other end, deposited across the desert in neat little packages of natural compost, already wrapped in nutrients, already prepared to grow. The horses had become living seed spreaders, carrying plant life from the few surviving patches of green and scattering it across barren ground that plants could never have reached on their own. And there's even more. It turns out the very act of a heavy animal walking across the land changes it. The desert surface was often sealed by a hard crust, a compacted layer that rain simply ran off of instead of soaking into. But the hooves of the horses broke that crust as they moved. They churned the top layer of soil, creating cracks and dips and rough spots where water could finally seep in instead of evaporating away. Those hoofprints became tiny catchments, little pockets that trapped rain and blowing seeds and dust, giving new plants a sheltered place to take root. What looked like random trampling was actually preparing the ground for growth. Put all of this together, and you begin to see the miracle. The horses fertilized the soil with their dung, they planted seeds across the land through their digestion, they broke up the hardened crust with their hooves so water could reach the roots, and they grazed in a natural, roaming pattern that trimmed the plants without destroying them, which actually encourages many grasses to grow back thicker and stronger, the same way mowing a lawn can make it fuller. Every single thing these horses did, just by living the way wild horses live, was quietly repairing the desert. And the land responded. Where there had been bare sand, thin blades of grass began to appear. Where the ground had been hard and dead, patches of green started to spread. And this is where the cascade truly began, because once a little vegetation returns, everything else follows. Insects moved in to feed on the new plants. Birds arrived to feed on the insects. Small mammals crept back into the area now that there was food and cover. The horses had cracked open the door and life came pouring through it. A single species, reintroduced to a place it had been missing from, was pulling an entire ecosystem back together, piece by piece. And there is one more effect that researchers found especially important in a place plagued by sandstorms. As those first grasses and hardy plants took hold, their roots reached down and gripped the loose soil, anchoring it in place. Bare desert sand is free to blow away with every gust of wind, feeding the storms that bury villages and choke distant cities. But land that is stitched together by living roots holds firm. So as the horses helped vegetation return, they were also, indirectly, helping to lock the sand down and calm the very storms that make desertification so destructive. A landscape that had been a source of blowing dust was slowly becoming a landscape that could hold itself together. One quiet change was rippling outward into problems that stretched hundreds of miles beyond the herd. Scientists have a name for animals like this. They call them keystone species. A keystone species is one that holds an entire ecosystem together, one whose presence or absence changes everything around it. Remove the keystone and the whole structure collapses. Return it, and the structure can rebuild itself. What the researchers realized was that these wild horses weren't just visitors in the desert. They were the missing keystone, the living gear that the entire ecosystem had been waiting for. For decades, people had been trying to heal the land from the outside, planting and watering and building barriers. But the land had been missing something from the inside. It had been missing the animals that were always supposed to be there. This is why the results shocked scientists. Not because grass grew. Grass growing is ordinary. What stunned them was how the horses achieved it, doing for free and for nothing what enormous human projects struggled to do with huge budgets and endless labor. The horses didn't need to be paid, they didn't need machinery, they didn't need instructions. They simply needed to be free to live as wild horses, and in living, they became one of the most efficient land restoration tools anyone had ever observed. Nature, it turned out, had engineered the solution long before humans ever showed up with a problem. And this discovery opened up an entirely new way of thinking. It is part of a bigger movement in science called rewilding, the idea that instead of micromanaging every corner of nature, we should sometimes step back and return the missing animals to a landscape, then let nature do what it has always known how to do. Rewilding has been tried in different forms around the world, bringing back wolves, bison, beavers, and other species that shape the land around them. And the results have been extraordinary. When these animals return, they can transform rivers, forests, and grasslands in ways scientists never fully predicted. The wild horses of the Chinese desert became a powerful new chapter in that story. Proof that even in one of the harshest environments on Earth, the right animal in the right place can spark a recovery. Of course, it is important to be honest about the limits here. A few dozen horses cannot single-handedly turn an entire desert the size of a country back into grassland. The scale of desertification is enormous, and reversing it will take many tools working together, from tree planting to water management to careful protection of the land. The horses are not a magic wand, but what they proved is that living ecosystems are far more resilient than we assumed, and that dead-looking land is often not truly dead. It is dormant, it is waiting, and sometimes all it needs is the return of the creatures that once belonged there to wake it back up. There is something deeply moving about that idea when you sit with it. These horses were driven to the edge of extinction by humans. They vanished from the wild completely, surviving only because a handful of people refused to give up on them. And now, generations later, those same horses are being returned to their ancient homeland, not just to save themselves, but to help heal the very land that humans damaged. It is a rare and beautiful kind of second chance, where saving a species and saving a landscape become the same act. The horses gave us a wound to answer for, and now, in a way, they are helping to heal it. Scientists continue to study these reintroduced herds closely, tracking how far they roam, how the vegetation shifts around them, and how the ecosystem keeps evolving year after year. Every season brings new data, new surprises, and new questions. Could this approach be expanded to larger areas? Could other lost animals be brought back to play their own roles? Could the lessons learned from these horses help other countries fighting their own battles against spreading deserts? The experiment that so many people expected to fail has instead become a living laboratory, teaching us that the future of restoring our planet might depend not only on what we build, but on what we are brave enough to set free. And that raises a question worth thinking about long after this video ends. For so long, we have treated nature as something to control, to fence in, to manage down to the smallest detail. But what if some of our greatest environmental victories will come from doing less, not more? What if the smartest thing we can do in certain places is to step aside, return the missing pieces, and trust the wild intelligence that shaped these ecosystems over millions of years? These horses, standing in a desert that everyone thought would kill them, turned out to be quiet proof that nature still knows things we are only beginning to understand. The barren desert that once looked like a death sentence is slowly, patch by patch, showing signs of life. Not because we forced it, but because we finally gave it back something it had lost. And somewhere out there right now, under a vast and burning sky, a herd of the last truly wild horses on Earth is roaming free across the land of their ancestors, quietly rewriting what we thought was possible. So here's my question for you. If a few wild horses can begin to bring a dead desert back to life, what other lost pieces of nature could we return to heal the damage we have done? Think about that for a second, because the answer might reshape the future of our entire planet. If this story amazed you even half as much as it amazed those scientists, do me a favor before you go. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Give this video a like to help it reach more curious minds, and share it with someone who still believes nature is powerless, because this is the proof that it is not. And down in the comments, tell me, would you want to see more animals rewilded into the places they were lost from? I want to hear what you think. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end, and I will see you in the next one.